Here we go. This is the Praise is Folly podcast. Today I'm joined again by Fulton and Henry Mencken to discuss the great generals of the Civil War and to investigate some of the myths, legends, and exaggerated reputations that have developed. I think for this purpose, we should probably start with Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, historically, especially after the Civil War and before the Civil Rights Movement, in both North and South, was revered, as a part of the binding the nation back together again. And his reputation is the two parts, much like Washington, as a commander and as a moral leader and a gentleman. That aspect I'm not going to talk about today, just like I didn't talk about that with Washington. But as a commander, I think that's interesting. Grant is often got the reputation as the butcher, and that comes from his wilderness campaigns. And more particularly from the beginning of the wilderness campaign until the end of Petersburg, when he begins the siege of Petersburg, he loses more men than was in Lee's entire army. But we need to remember, though, that Lee could not afford to lose large bodies of men. And there are two instances in which he was quite foolish in how he used his men. The 7 days, 20,000 men out of 80,000, or 20%, 25% of his effectives in 7 days. And I think he lost about half of that at Mechanicsville.
Now you have to go back. You have to go back even earlier, and you have to look at his absolutely botched West Virginia campaign in the first year of the war. He does it again there.
It's true. Other than lastly, and then I'll turn it over to you, Fulton, is Gettysburg. Why, oh why, oh why did he send Pickett's brigade at the center of the Union line on the high ground, where he got enfiladating fire from both right and left Union flanks? I mean, that was just a complete blunder of the first order. Every bit as disastrous as Burnside at Fredericksburg.
Well, I mean, that attack at Gettysburg, Pickett's charge, part of it was made on a gamble that circumstances would go in his favor, such as the weather would be bad enough, as it had been in previous assaults, to weaken enemy artillery, so because they hadn't been locked in a number of engagements. He was gambling on a number of those things going wrong. He was also operating with incomplete knowledge about some of those weapon systems that we would know after the war, but he didn't know at that time. So I think it was a combination of hubris, and I say that as somebody who thinks Lee is one of the greatest military commanders ever. But again, all men are mortal and flawed to some degree. Gambling on things beyond his control and incorrect information from the fog of war, and he went big and risked things he shouldn't have, and I think he was just committed to the point that he decided he had to do something. Unfortunately, it was the wrong thing.
Well, this is the thing. We have to just go back and just talk about Robert E. Lee for a second and think about, well, what is his background? Who is his father?
Light Horse Harry Lee, and primarily his background was as an engineer. He was one of the first generation of professional military engineers in the United States Army trained at West Point.
This is incredibly important. Just to dip into the psyche of Robert E. Lee for a second. He is an engineer, okay? He's from an illustrious military family, and he was considered by Winfield Scott to be the rising star of the American military at the end of the Mexican War. And then what happens? Stagnation. He's out in Texas. I can't remember exactly. Maybe it was El Paso. It's somewhere way out on the periphery. And he's
basically, it was Galveston.
Yeah, maybe it was. Yeah, Galveston is. In fact, if you go look at a map, Galveston is nearly the absolute periphery of the United States at the time. But he's got this very strong sense of missed opportunities his entire life. Okay. And when he signs up for the Confederacy, he has another. When he signs on with the Confederacy, he has another missed opportunity. He is immediately put in charge of a small army. It's not a large army, because this is considered. When we think about the Civil War, we think of pretty much almost everyone is going to conceptualize two theaters with roughly two opposing armies. There's the Army of the Potomac, The North named their armies after rivers. The South named their armies after states. So you're going to have the Army of the Potomac versus the Army of Northern Virginia, and then in the West you're going to have the Army of the Tennessee versus the Army of Mississippi, and that's usually more or less the way it stays throughout the entire war. But early on, Robert E. Lee is given this opportunity to command soldiers, and he flubs it up, earns himself the nickname Granny Lee. And then he gets jerked off the front line because one of the things he is famous for are these defensive earthworks. He's famous for forcing his soldiers to dig as much as they do march. Okay, so whenever
they call them
when he is finally given this opportunity at 7 days in particular, the Malvern Hill, I always have to give Robert E. Lee a pass for Malvern Hill, because if you look at what actually happened, the course of, I think it was the Battle of Seven Pines prior to that, the one where Johnson is wounded, the Federals are, at one point, this is like one of these, famous sort of instances where in Richmond, the Confederate capital, they're listening to the sound of the approaching Federal army. It comes very close, and so when Robert E. Lee gets the nod here, he has to punch really hard, really fast, and the only way, and he has to do it more than once. So this is what he does: is he punches hard, and then he punches hard again, and he punches hard again. The problem with Malvern Hill is that, he had good intel that indicated that this probably wasn't a great idea. But again, this is one of these opportunities that's difficult to pass up. You have the entire Army of the Potomac bottled up. They're strung out, trying to escape back onto the boats that took them, that brought them to the peninsula. And here's an opportunity. This is what Robert E. Lee, and the early commanders in the Civil War are always obsessed with this concept, almost the same way German commanders are obsessed with Cannae in World War I. Is they want to encircle and destroy an entire Federal army. And as far as I know, I think Vicksburg may be the only instance of it happening during the Civil War. But that's what he tries to do, and he does. In the 7 days battles, he does lose a significant chunk of his force, but it's hard to call it anything other than a strategic and tactical win, because he's fighting, he's basically fighting to be able to fight another day. And when his back is against the wall, he's usually able to do that at least.
Yeah. Your thoughts, Mencken?
I definitely defer to Fulworth on this in terms of being more developed in terms of idea. Lee, like I said, came into this war. He is a West Pointer and an engineer. He's part of that first generation of actual professional engineering officers in the U.S. military. Famously, you talk about Winfield Scott saying he was going to be the most successful officer the most important rising star of the Army at that time. Is understand the generational difference there is Winfield Scott was a political appointee. He came from the generation before the creation of West Point and Norwich University and the Southern military schools, where the majority of officers in the U.S. Army got their commissions through patronage and were appointed there. And Winfield Scott was famously part of that group that said we need to professionalize those guys who got here by patronage and basically pull up that ladder, as it were, and have actual professionals in the Army. So that frames a lot about Lee. Is Lee somebody who operates very well in that paradigm as it was developed at that time, which means that in some ways people like that aren't necessarily the best at creating paradigms or changing the rule sets, as it were, which is, a contrast between him and him and Jackson. I'm sorry. So yeah, those are the things I think about. I have an immense amount of respect for Lee. I think he was one of the greatest field commanders in American history. At the same time, he made mistakes, Gettysburg being one of them. That unfortunately, if he had decided otherwise, we could conceivably have an independent South. So.
Exactly. Now, the one thing that Lee was really good at was defensive works, and so when the Mobile Frontier campaign is done in 1864, and then they settle in for the Long Siege, that's where Lee shines and his original engineering excellence comes out. He builds some pretty brutal entrenchments, even during the battles of the Wilderness. His thrown up entrenchments like at Cold Harbor, bled Grant terribly. You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, that happened in several points, especially towards the end of the camp, Richmond, Petersburg, Cold Harbor, and whatnot. So, yeah, it's a good strategy to make the other guy bleed when you don't need to, make them do the dying when you don't need to, make them weaken themselves so it becomes easier to kill them. Unfortunately, at that time, the spigot was turned on, as it were, and essentially everything that was bled away from Grant's army could be replaced. And they weren't going to kill them quick enough to for there to be some kind of political upheaval to slow down the spigot. So it was masterful work that unfortunately doesn't matter against somebody who just has turned on the spigot and is willing to bleed people to death.
Mm-hmm. There's another aspect of Lee as well. He was a great user of deception. So, for example, in the 7 Days campaign, he was able to get McClellan to think that his army was at least 50% larger than it actually was, which bought him time to bring the disparate Confederate forces together to the Army of Northern Virginia, so Jackson from the Valley and elsewhere, in order to make that push. So that's definitely one of Lee's strengths there. Now, while we're waiting for Fuller, hopefully he gets back soon, I think the next thing would be Stonewall Jackson. Oh boy, he cannot get in. This is not good.
Let's see what we can do to get him on.
Yeah, hold on a second, people. We got to get this guy back on.
The communications are amazing.
It sounds like it says he's been kicked, but
I didn't do it.
Neither did I. He said he messaged me and said that he clicked on the wrong button.
Yeah.
I guess while we're waiting, we'll just pick up with Stonewall. Stonewall Jackson. Why don't you open up with Stonewall?
I think Stonewall Jackson was the best trainer, organizer of troops of the Confederacy during that war. In some ways, in that role in particular, he's comparable to McClellan, which again, most Americans, most aficionados, offensive. But like I said before we got on the line, I look at this somewhat from a 21st century perspective on how armies are. The guy who organized and put together the forces is a different person from those who leads them in the field. And in that sense, if that 50% of the job that Jackson did and also McClellan did of putting together an army, I think Jackson did it better than just about any commander I can think of in modern military history. And that is a big deal. He did an amazing job as far as putting troops together, training them, getting them to fight at a very effective level, and then leading them in the field with a very dynamic, adaptive approach. The biggest thing I say about Jackson, the biggest tragedy of Jackson, is the guy who ultimately was killed in the course of doing a reconnaissance in the field, killed by his own pickets coming back. And the first thing I would say from that is somebody who's been essentially a consultant for units preparing to deploy, is why is a general officer doing the reconnaissance guy who preaches developing subordinates to be able to do everything that they should be able to? He should have had somebody else doing that on his behalf. He never should have been forward of the lines, and that, I think, is a tragedy.
Well, the one thing that has to be remembered about Jackson is he was an extremely eccentric individual. He used to
understatement.
Eat food he didn't like, and used to think that one half of his body had to have fluids drained down to the other half, so he'd hold his left arm up in the air. Good.
I was going to say he was probably autistic of some sort. He was probably on the spectrum. when he left active duty, he trained at Virginia Military Institute. He was professor of artillery tactics and natural philosophy. So the artillery tactics taught in ROTC, because again, ROTC was branch specific until the 1950s. Excuse me. And natural philosophy was physics, like Physics 101, sort of a Newtonian mechanic. And he was famous when he would teach his physics class. Somebody would ask him a question, and he would go and recite verbatim, because he had memorized his lectures verbatim, the portion of the lecture on that topic, as if he was not capable of even understanding, or it's a grokking under, for lack of a better word, the portion of the knowledge this cadet was showing that he didn't understand, and trying to isolate that information. He just couldn't understand it in a less rote, mechanical manner. But at the same time, he was known for being innovative in the field, which I have no expertise to basis, but it sounds almost like somebody on the spectrum who thinks primarily in images and shapes as opposed to words. And that's just my thought on it. Yeah.
The other thing is that Jackson was unique in the sense that while the United States in the middle of the 19th century was, you might say, conventionally Christian, Stonewall Jackson took it very personally. He viewed himself as like an Old Testament patriarch in like Joshua or Caleb style. And,
I was going to say he's a Southern Calvinist, which I believe he was Presbyterian, but he worshipped at Episcopalian churches with Lee at different times. But he's almost more like a very hardcore Southern Baptist, or a Pentecostal almost, and that movement didn't exist at the time. Just somebody who sees both Old and New Testaments as something that's living and breathing and must be lived out. And he saw his military duties as much a part of that larger mission in his life as anything. And he never saw any conflict between the warrior aspect and the peacetime aspect of those things. And like I said, when many commanders were sort of looking at how they could just be the better version of America / European type 19th century army, Jackson was the guy who would start giving speeches about, resurrecting the spirit of Sparta and the Old Testament military organizations, because he really saw his guys as either Spartiates or, Hebraic soldiers, depending on the day of the week. And sometimes he thought they were both those things.
Well, to give a highlight for his personality, there was one point in the Mexican War when he was appointed as an artillery position underneath in the siege of Mexico City in an inferior position, and everybody just shooting around him. And when the battle was over, people were like, Jackson, why didn't you move? Weren't you afraid? He's like, I didn't even know anything was going on. That just shows you the kind of person Jackson was.
Yeah, I mean he got the name Stonewall for being unflappable under fire and keeping his unit disciplined and calm under fire. And that seems to be true to character, as it were.
All right, forward, Stonewall Jackson. Is your audio working, Fuller? Well, until he gets his audio up. Obviously, his Valley campaign is brilliant. I think at most he was outnumbered 3-1, and constantly kept the Union forces on their toes. Jackson was also known as the foot cavalry because his men were so fast. So
they were that maneuverable under fire too. What was it? The one north of Richmond, was it Chancellorsville, where he essentially did a strategic or a flank with the forces before doing an actual a feint before a flank, and that was just impressive. He wielded them more or less the way cavalry would be wielded on the battlefield.
Yeah,
which again sort of suggests that he's somebody who thinks in terms of shapes as opposed to words, just because you can see things conceptually the way pieces can fit together before you can explain them. And if you've drilled your troops to the point that they can execute commands on order, you can get that out of them.
Yeah, the other aspect about Jackson is that he could think outside of the box. Now, we mentioned this before about the American Revolution. The British were at the top of their game, and so the rebels had to reinvent the rules if they were going to defeat the British. And given the classic Napoleonic style of warfare that all of Europe and even in North America we followed slavishly, the North had all the advantages in such a conflict, and the South really needed to reinvent the rules. And Jackson seemed to show the indication that he was beginning to think like that. He wrote a letter to Robert E. Lee at the end of the Valley Campaign where he basically says that if he was given 40,000 men, he might move beyond the Potomac, which would raise the siege of Richmond and transfer the campaign from the banks of the James to the Susquehanna. So we're basically talking about, essentially Gettysburg in 1862 in the spring with Jackson still alive. That would have been a whole different scenario. And yet
Gettysburg was something that it sounds like the score church policy that Sherman was going to use.
Oh, you mean what Jackson said sounds like a permanent?
Yeah, Jackson sounds almost like Gettysburg, except with the scorched earth policy of Sherman.
Yeah. One aspect, the sort of all the richness and flavor of Jackson, I think is caught pretty well in Gods and Generals. I think they do a pretty good job of showing the whole gamut of the eccentricities and genius of Jackson.
Yeah, Jackson. That's. I think some of those vignettes about him just as his eccentricity and the fact that not just that he was eccentric, but the fact he owned his eccentricity and made it work in ways is important to understanding a lot of his success as a leader. It's like one of the things I really respect is, or really appreciate is that story of him when he was first organizing Virginia troops in the far western part of Virginia, what became West Virginia. And he requested the cadets from the Virginia Military Institute, the Corps, be marched out there to assist for something like 2 weeks. Well, as soon as the cadets got out there, he says, all right, I'm in charge now. You guys are here to train. And he basically kept them for close to a summer or whatever. And that's how he organized a large portion of what became the Army of the Northern Virginia in the process. So even the simplest things, he was willing to innovate and change the rules. And just like you said, they were slavishly following to Napoleonic conventions. I think that's what you said. But it's important to understand that Napoleon was a military leader who essentially upended the paradigm. The military paradigm was there when he came in and redefined things. So emulating or slavishly copying Napoleon in a lot of ways is sort of like focusing on the artifacts of what Napoleon did and missing the substance. It's again, it's copying by rote, almost like a cargo cult, without ever adopting the innovativeness that Napoleon had. Whereas again, somebody like Jackson, he apparently, because he was a military historian, military professional, was as well aware of Napoleonic warfare as anybody, but he didn't really care. But he was innovative in the same way Napoleon did by redefining the rules, as you said.
Can y'all hear me now?
Yeah. So Jackson,
what are your thoughts on Stonewall Jackson? And
are you talking to me?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So you all can hear me.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have been sitting here every time one of y'all pauses for the last 2 minutes, being like, "Can y'all hear me? Can you hear me?" I finally figured out how to get the microphone to work. Jackson is he's one of these guys, and I'm kind of I'm sort of a historical counter signaler because I didn't get to finish railing.
You don't say.
And didn't get to finish railing on Lee, which is sort of what I kind of do. But in terms of Jackson, well, we and you asked me about Jackson specifically. Now, Jackson is one of these people who's it's so difficult to talk about Civil War commanders without falling into one or the other historiographical schools. I mean, and this is one of these ways where, William Faulkner said the past isn't dead, it's not even past. And so, and probably more books have been written about, more books have been written about the Civil War than I think than any other topic. It's one every 5 minutes since the war ended. And so much of what was produced by Jubal Early, and a lot of these guys who died during the war they sort of, it's sort of a way where you go out on top. You go out at the absolute peak of your myth, and you didn't get to live, to see your, to have to try and defend your accomplishments. Jackson's accomplishments are, legion. Okay, I don't want to sell this guy short, entirely, but I also want to, to just demolish the myth a little bit. The Valley Campaign is, this is military brilliance, but Jackson is, he's temperamental, he's difficult to get along with in the best of, at the best of times, and he does sort of, and I don't know how much of this can be imputed to, the vaunted, Southern military tradition, but Jackson does something. It's sort of like, how people in the alt-right or something like that, they refuse to use a sock, or to refuse to use a sock account, and then they become unemployable forever. Confederate generals in the Civil War had a tendency to try to move too close to the fighting. And not only does this has a number, this has a number of consequences. One, you can get shot by your own sentries, which is eventually what happens to him, but also it breaks down communication on the battlefield. And this is something that happens is if you step outside of Jackson's brilliant victories. If you look at, he's another one of these guys that at the 7 Days battles, it's a very unimpressive showing. He's sort of like Jeb, and it's sort of like Jeb Stuart riding all the way around the army, or, the Army of the Potomac. Cool. But why? Jackson is one of these people who is a legendary figure in his own time. And, he becomes a part of the Confederate propaganda process. And so, like, where he is good, he is brilliant, but where he's not brilliant, he's not necessarily, where he's not brilliant, he's frequently lackluster. So if you go, look at, if you look at situations where, he's the myth of Stonewall Jackson isn't in play, then, he becomes a good deal less impressive. And I have a difficult time forgiving him, or, not judging him, to say it in a more impartial fashion, for getting killed. Because it is possibly true that he was the greatest chance the Confederacy had to win. And he goes and gets himself killed in a fashion that really didn't need to happen. And so, so this is one of these things where Jackson is great, but he's always been like, it's a part of this mythologizing of Virginia as like, this state that can do no wrong in the eyes of most Southerners. And he is frequently wrong. He's combative personally. Like, he'll disobey orders occasionally. Whenever, he has to be chastised with relative frequency. He's cruel to his own soldiers sometimes in like ways that, can't quite be explained by, military necessity. But
I mean, Testament guy.
Yeah. I mean, that he may have been autistic. He may have been, he was definitely what, even by the standards of his own day, he's a religious nut. He like his specific, he likes to fight on the Sabbath though. I mean, he's a strange guy. He's hard to like personally. And the military victories are sound. There are a lot of them until 1863, whenever he gets killed. And I would also lay, part of the Chancellorsville stuff. This is inarguably Lee's greatest tactical victory, but I'm not sure it has the strategic echoes. And almost all of my friends are listen to this they're gonna flame me for it somewhere, but I'm not sure what exactly strategic gain there is to Chancellorsville, except to once again try and destroy this federal army. And at this point in time, you should be aware that destroying the federal army wasn't going to happen. So this is like another one of these things where Robert E. Lee, sometimes whenever he is, like it's Second Manassas, you have to fight that battle. You have to fight the 7 days. You don't have to fight Antietam. You don't have to fight Gettysburg. And so a lot of times these guys are even some of their greatest triumphs ring relatively hollow at the end of the day.
Oh, one more thing. Jackson did relatively poorly at Antietam as well.
Yeah, well, that's the one I was thinking. I can't remember. I don't know much about Antietam because I'm not like this is like something that over the course of this conversation will become apparent. I focus a lot more on the Western theater and in particular Trans-Mississippi theater. I guess like I'm sure somebody else knows the specifics of what Jackson did at Antietam better than I do. But I mean, I know on that day he showed up at exactly the right moment. Jackson he's one of these people who his ability to move around the state is really good. I think this is probably his biggest strength, is his ability to move quickly. But once he shows up, he's not really, he's nothing particularly spectacular. Like the day he got his nickname, Stonewall or whatever, right up until the point where he becomes a legend, the brigadiers to the left and right of him on the battlefield are complaining about his inactivity and his tendency to not communicate. He doesn't communicate when he becomes a corps commander. He doesn't communicate orders, and this is a problem. It was a problem on the federal side as well, but it's particularly a problem on the Confederate side. They don't necessarily communicate orders up and down the chain of command very well, and so you have a lot of instances where relatively, and this is striking at the myth of Confederate myth of Confederate command supremacy. This is probably true in the early stages of the war, but generals on both sides, considerably higher casualties on the Confederate side, but generals on both sides of this war get killed. Brigadier generals get killed a lot. And by the third year of the war, really, it's probably by the second year of the war, the average Union brigadier is a good deal more competent than the average Confederate brigadier, because the average Union brigadier is going to be a professional soldier, and the Confederacy, there's a lot of simony and nepotism, that sort of thing going on in the Confederate hierarchy, where if somebody from the House of Burgesses decides they want to send their kid out to go fight in the war or whatever, they make him a brigadier general, put him in charge of people or whatever. So unless he has really specific orders about exactly how to behave on the battlefield, a lot of times he's making it up on his own and he doesn't make the best decisions.
Yeah, a lot of federal commanders were promoted during the war. The ones who were professionals were promoted to the war during the general officers ranks, and then reduced down to a permanent rank afterwards. Famously, what was his name? Custer being one of them. General Custer was actually just a lieutenant colonel who had been a full general during the war. So yeah, they were professional soldiers. Many of these guys had spent, over a decade in the ranks or as junior officers, and some of them were, permanent captains and retired as captains, but they were general officers at that point.
I believe in the United States Peacetime Army at the time, the United States Peacetime Army was small. There aren't even a whole lot of colonel positions that are open. And I think when it initially started, I think the Confederacy only grabbed one, maybe two people who had held the rank of general in the peacetime American Army. I think it was Albert Sidney Johnston and Joe Johnston. I think both of them were generals and nobody else was.
Yeah. I mean, Lee was just a lieutenant colonel, right? Or was he a full colonel at that point?
He was a full colonel, but he was relatively far down on the list of colonel, because the way it worked, because there was no war to fight. Most of these guys have made their name. If for whatever reason you missed, and there's at least one famous example of somebody who did, I can't remember who it was, but he missed the Mexican War, and maybe it was Nathan Bedford Forrest. He misses the Mexican War, and so as a result, he has no battlefield record. And so the only way there is to be promoted is politicking, and you just sat on a waiting list and you waited for people to retire or die. And at the moment when Winfield Scott offered Lee the command of the army, he was like 57th colonel or something like that in line to become the next general.
Yeah. And for context, just like you said, Winfield Scott is still on active duty in the Army as a general. So that'll give you an idea of how old the general officer corps that both sides inherited was at the start of the war.
I mean, he's one of these people that is like, he's ancient even by the standards of his own day. Whenever he finally quits, this is like one of those dudes who lives forever. And it's like, he's one of those people who lives long enough to see his own creations come back to bite him in the ass, in a lot of ways.
Well, I think the third of the big three Confederate generals is usually Longstreet, and I think Longstreet, while his reputation has never risen to as high as Jackson or Lee. The one thing that is interesting because most of his career in the Army of Northern Virginia, Longstreet is a subordinate of Lee. I think he's a corps commander, but he's actually commands the Confederate Army in the Western Theater, and that's at Chickamauga, and it's one of the only Confederate victories in the Western Theater. And if it hadn't been for the inspired defense of George Henry Thompson, the Army of the Tennessee might have just vaporized after Chickamauga.
Well, I don't. Chickamauga is one of these battles that is always referred to as a Confederate victory. I'm not seeing it personally, because what you have is a situation where who was the God? What is his name? Is it Bragg?
Rosecrans.
Yeah, no. The Confederate overall commander. I can't remember if it was Bragg at this point. I think it's Braxton Bragg. Somebody check me on that. But he has if you look at the strategic situation of the Confederacy, and this is where I know at least one guy after he's red-faced screaming at his television at me right now because I've just drug a couple of his heroes through the mud. But one of the things you have to look at is if you look at this map of Confederate railroads. The myth is always that there's not very many of them. There's not much Confederate manufacturing. I can push back against that all you want to, but there's one thing that's very apparent. There is this one railroad that runs from Richmond. Basically, it's the carotid artery of the aorta of the entire Confederacy, and at this juncture of the war. It runs right underneath Tennessee, and then it peters out, somewhere. I think it peters out in like southern Arkansas into a bunch of trunk lines that were undeveloped at the time. But the key element, the key section of it is this section that runs between Virginia and Tennessee, and its junction is at Chattanooga. And in order to fight the Battle of Chickamauga, the Confederate Army has to retreat, and there's not any real consensus that they needed to retreat from the position they were holding in Chattanooga, and the only reason to retreat from the strategic situation that they had in Chattanooga is in order to bring the Federal Army to a decisive battle and again defeat it. And I've been referring over and over again to this notion. The two theaters in a lot of ways are also a tale of two cities, because in the East, people are constantly preoccupied with this idea of destroying whole armies, whereas in the West, as like I said, the one instance I can think of off the top of my head happens in the West, and then the Confederacy is frequently paralyzed by shitty leadership in the West after the death of Albert Sidney Johnston. He may be another one of those people who died just in time to save himself from being absolutely slandered in the historical record. But the Confederacy retreats to northern Georgia, and the Union Army makes a terrible blunder, which is dividing themselves in half. And unlike the instances when Robert E. Lee does this, they didn't get away with it, because the two armies have lost contact with one another. They don't exactly know where one another are, but the way the situation plays out is significant portions of the Confederate Army find themselves make contact with a separated section of the Union, Army somewhere to the southwest of Chickamauga, and it's several whole divisions that are entirely unreinforced, and the Confederacy has I think they have like 3-to-1 numerical odds here, which is in Clausewitz's book, that's the prescribed numerical advantage for offensive action, and it probably would have held. And this is an instance where the Confederacy has a chance to encircle and destroy a large portion of the Union Army, and they don't do it because the two Confederates, again, and one of them was Bolivar Buckner, so. You know, or one of them is, I think so. Oh, maybe he was, I can't remember which side.
I thought Buckner was captured by Grant at the beginning of his campaign.
Yeah, it's one of these. It's one of these guys. Sometimes the names will slide through my head, slide through my head sometimes. But there's two Confederate commanders in charge of divisions. One of them is a very large division. The other one has a smaller division, and they're, you know, they sit. It's 2 whole days without attacking, just waiting on the other one to make the first move. And during this time, the Union thinks they're screwed. These guys feel like, you know, it's all over. And Confederate inactivity again and uncoordinated behavior allows them to reinforce so the Confederacy decisively wins on the field at Chickamauga, but again, there's no real strategic gain. And to make matters worse, following Chickamauga, they failed to reoccupy Chattanooga, and this is the final loss of that railway junction that really starts to. This is when the material squeeze can really start to be put on the Confederacy.
Yeah, the other thing with Longstreet is in his command in the West, at least from my knowledge, he was always a competent and able subordinate to Lee. In fact, didn't Lee sort of rely on him as a pseudo Jackson after Jackson died?
Well, he calls Jackson his right-hand man, and he calls Longstreet his old warhorse. Longstreet is my favorite commander of the entire war. This is a guy who
counter-signaled everything.
This is a guy who this is a guy who I cannot say enough good things about. There are a few good commanders, and you know, Longstreet does get shot by his own sentries as well eventually. But there are a few of these guys who I think get it in a way, and like Mencken and I both like to talk about Kuhn's, structured scientific revolutions, and there's a sort of, the Civil War marks a drastic paradigm shift. Yeah, in the way war is fought, and the way this sort of works is that, you know, people who are operate on in opposing paradigms have totally different concepts of what the truth is, to such an extent that they almost can't understand one another when they're talking. And this is what's playing out, especially at places like Gettysburg. Whenever you see Longstreet just absolutely flabbergasted, and you know, there's that they really ham it up in the movie Gettysburg, you know, where, you know, Longstreet is sitting there just looking absolutely forlorn as he gives the command to attack. But I mean, this is true over and over again. Pete Longstreet, and I'm refer to this guy by, you know, by this name because I like him that much. He understood the way this new world of warfare would be fought. I mean, he's invented trench warfare in a lot of every way, in a lot of ways, before trench warfare really gets invented in the Civil War. He understands this is the way he's going. And so what is, you know, and he's you know, the way he and Lee interacted is sort of strange, because Lee a lot of times admits to not really being able to understand why Longstreet thinks the things he does, but he has learned in a lot of cases that, you know, if you listen to him, good things happen. But here we're at Gettysburg. This is one of these instances where, like, this idea of them operating on separate objective truths sort of like rears its head, because at no point in time does Longstreet ever get the benefit of the doubt in like touch and go situations, which is what you have at Gettysburg. And I think it's safe to say that, you know, especially with the gift of hindsight, that if the Army of Northern Virginia follows Longstreet's prescription, which is to retreat, dig in between Washington D.C. and the Army of Northern Virginia, and you could have a second Fredericksburg. You know, you find a stone wall to hide behind, and Meade will be, because Meade is facing astonishing political pressure from the rear to attack. He will walk into another bloodbath. You could have had Cold Harbor in 1863 instead of when it happened, and it could have had a drastic
something.
It could have had a drastic strategic impact. And just to talk for a couple of reasons why Longstreet is probably not given his due, and one of these reasons is because he becomes a Republican after the war, and so Jubal Early and all they slander him, but even during the war, he's an incredibly dark person. He's prone to fits of depression. His kids died during the war, and he hardly says anything about it. He's a deep Southerner. This is the Army of Northern Virginia is a gentleman's club. And, Pete Longstreet is this like rough and tumble, like, deep South Scots Irishman. He's not from an aristocratic English family. He does not.
He wasn't Scots Irish though, because he was Dutch.
Oh, he's Dutch. Yeah, no, he's Dutch. So yeah, he doesn't fit in a lot.
Families are New Yorkers. They're guys who somehow ended up in the South.
He doesn't fit in with the social structure of the Army of Northern Virginia, and this is one of these things why. Lee parted with him very, it's an almost schizophrenic relationship sometimes. I don't understand why Longstreet wasn't given command of the entire Western Theater, because at this point there are nasty leadership, leadership fissures opening between Jefferson Davis and his commander in the West. Just refusal to send reinforcements out of spite in some cases, refusal to follow orders out of spite in some instances, and you have your coolest, most level-headed corps commander who has, to date, his field record is nearly perfect, and you've gone through the trouble of detaching him from the Army of Northern Virginia. Why don't you keep him there? What is the what is the thinking here?
Yeah, I think ultimately the thinking is they decided that they had to win in the Virginia theater because that was the only way to win.
And at that point, at this point in time, things are degenerating pretty quickly, if not in the actual army camp in the Confederate government. The situation's getting real. This is around the time of the hunger marches, in Richmond, where Jefferson Davis threatens to shoot down the wives of Richmond because they're marching for food rations and that sort of thing. The situation's pretty ugly already by then.
The Anaconda Plan is close to being in full effect, so a large part of the South is effectively strangled. It's not just they couldn't get anything out externally; we've been cut off from many of the internal rivers and railroads, as you said, so they don't have the ability to move supplies very well between one part of the Confederacy to another, even when they do have them. And sometimes they famously had, storehouses of food that was rotting and uniforms that could never get out to the field, and even sometimes cannons that never got out to where they were needed just because they couldn't move them from point A to point B. So it's almost like a body that has its circulation system. It's choked out.
Mm-hmm. I think it's now probably time to switch to analyzing some of the reputations of Union generals and how they stack up. One Union general that gets a lot of flack that I think it's mostly undeserved because Lincoln didn't like him was McClellan. First of all, people tend to forget this, but McClellan was the first Union general to beat Lee, and he was in the West Virginia campaign. But then once Lee was in command of the Army of North Virginia, it was at Antietam. Now, people like to belittle that victory by saying, well, he had Order 191. Well, so what? Most of U.S. victories in World War II were because we cracked the Enigma code. Does that then, say that our accomplishments in D-Day or in Italy were less effective? Of course not.
Right. The Order 191 incident this is another example of Confederate command chain. Communication chain breaking the hell down. Now I don't know exactly how you avoid it or whatever, but it's this is one of these, you play with fire long enough you will get burned. So sort of instances. And McClellan is I think he's the North's Pete Longstreet. I think he you know, especially in the early stages of the war, he is their best field commander, because he sort of, I mean, he's very hesitant to put, you know, to put the lives of his men in jeopardy. In part because he's planning on running for president, and you know, he's believed to have some vague copperhead tendencies or something like that. But if you look at his, you know, his actions in the Peninsular Campaign, they're not necessarily bad. He's, you know, he's driving towards the Confederate capital, and then something drastic changes. And he doesn't lose the 7 days battles nearly as badly as especially propagandists like Jubal Early, especially, you know, propagandists like Jubal Early are going to try and say they are. But you can say McClellan kills more of Lee's army consistently than Lee does of his. You know, in terms of relative casualties, Lee's casualties are on average 3 to 6% higher than McClellan's.
Exactly.
So like he's, you know, he's not losing, he's not really losing much, and he is, you know, he sort of fits in with this Anaconda plan. It's probably a much better long-term military strategy because he understood that the Confederacy, you know, he understood the strategic situation, which is that the Confederacy has to win battles. I just have to keep an army in the field.
Yeah, and there's another aspect too with McClellan. Most historians who write about the Civil War they often compare unfairly Grant to McClellan. And they'll say that Grant kept on pushing after the Wilderness and McClellan didn't. Well, there's two very good reasons why McClellan didn't. Grant could rely on was not yet created. And you still have the draft riots in New York in 1863 to look forward to. So if McClellan had blown 50,000 men in a week like Grant did, the Army of the Potomac would have disappeared.
Right. That would have been it. The war would have been over.
The war would have been over. And second of all, Bobby Lee was at the height of his power. 80,000 men he brought to bear the Peninsular Campaign, whereas in the Wilderness it was only a paltry 50,000.
Yeah, I mean, this is like one of these things where we tend to sort of think of the Civil War as this, you know, this epic, you know, and it was an epic war, but it was a very dynamic war. The way the war was fought in 1860 bears very little resemblance, you know, to what the Crater looked like or something like that. You know, we have, and movies and stuff have sort of ruined this. In addition to making Confederates look like well-fed middle-aged men, they also they perpetuate this idea that the Civil War was primarily fought, you know, with, you know, block formations of men marching towards one another on the battlefield and firing volleys back. There's surprisingly little of this, especially out west, and even in battles like the Wilderness. I mean, the shining examples of it happening always end badly for the army that's making an attack, and so they actually do learn relatively quickly not to do it. Malvern Hill is an instance of it happening. You know, the attacking force gets blown away. It happens again at the assault on Marye's Heights at Fredericksburg is another instance of it happening, and again the attacker just gets absolutely blown away. So they quit doing this, and you add political considerations, technical considerations. There are a lot of reasons why Grant is operating under, again, you talk about paradigm shifts. Grant is operating on a whole other paradigm than McClellan was. He has repeating rifles. He has a president who has given him carte blanche and in fact orders to drive forward irregardless of casualties. And Grant didn't necessarily want to do it either. But that's just getting ahead of ourselves, talking about Grant too much. McClellan is, he's one of these. I think he's maybe, possibly, other than Pete Longstreet, maybe the most underrated commander of the war.
Well, I would actually say there's one guy who's even more underrated, and who I think, by looking at the examples, is he was never given a strategic position like, say, Lee or Grant, and so we can't really judge him on that level. But as a tactician and an operational commander, the Unionist from Tennessee, George Henry Thomas, I think, was probably the finest tactical commander of the war. So in the very beginning, in the West Virginia campaign, at the Battle of Falling Waters, he actually goes toe-to-toe with Stonewall and routs him. But more importantly, in Tennessee, in 1862, in the winter of 1862, he blunts Bragg's move into Kentucky at Stones River and Perryville. And
Stones River is one of these battles that hardly anybody knows about, but just, so many people died. Over 10,000 casualties over 2 days. And this is one of the most unknown battles of the war.
It was, yeah. And then furthermore, he's so then he's the guy that saves the Army of the Cumberland from the disaster of Chickamauga, where when he's on Snodgrass Hill, he holds off all of Longstreet's troops till he's ordered to retreat. And then when Grant takes the field at Chattanooga, he takes Missionary Ridge. Now, by 1864, Grant has his grand strategy to march into the heart of the South. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the 1864 campaigns of Grant and Sherman, they're both prone to make really stupid decisions, like attacking entrenched positions for Grant at Cold Harbor, Spotsylvania, and then Sherman at Kennesaw Ridge. Whereas if you look at the Franklin-Nashville campaign, it was nearly flawless. George Thomas does not run into entrenched Confederate positions and get blown to pieces. And at Nashville, he skillfully outmaneuvers the Confederate Army of Tennessee, led by Braxton Bragg, and basically destroys it as an effective combat force. It doesn't begin to reorganize until the early winter of 1865 to fight Sherman. And really, when he's in command, he never loses. And when he's mopping up for someone's screw-ups, he saves the day. Now, one of the reasons why Thomas is overlooked is Lincoln didn't like him, much like he didn't like McClellan. He was, quote, too slow. I find it interesting that McClellan and Thomas, the men that actually cared about the lives of their soldiers, are the ones that are the bad generals. And the Grant and Sherman, the butchers, are the good generals. But also, he was considered to be too slow. But again, he was methodical. And when he let the hammer fall, he was called the Sledge of Nashville. I mean, Grant and Sherman weren't sledges. They were more like ice. Well, Grant was more like an ice sheet. But I think that his tactical and operational reputation is unspotted. And the fact that he doesn't have a higher reputation is, I think, pretty criminal.
Well, one of the reasons he doesn't have a higher reputation probably is because there's not just a whole lot to pill pull. Like he really is. I mean, it's it's sort of like nobody likes the teacher's pet. He really is nearly perfect. And this is right, because I hadn't been thinking about it. I mean, I think I probably agree with that assessment. Yeah, it's nearly flawless.
Now, again, he's not a strategist, so comparing him to Grant or Jackson or Lee, maybe in that category may not be the best. But in tactics and operations, I don't think anybody in any army except maybe Stonewall Jackson would do better than Thomas. But even Thomas doesn't have those lethargic moments like at 7 days. He's always ready to. In fact, Grant didn't like it that after Shiloh, Thomas said, "Man, you really screwed it, man. You should have had pickets and prepared positions. You got caught with your pants down." Grant didn't like that, and after the war, Grant and Sherman wrote him out of the history. So that's part of why Thomas got overlooked. But I do think that Thomas and McClellan have been unfairly judged by history. McClellan certainly had a different situation than Grant did 2 years later. And Thomas was pretty much perfect. So, it's like,
well, this is also part of the historiographical process of myth making, which, I mean, no matter how hard I try to avoid it, I can't do with the Civil War. Because so much of, this is virtually a second founding. The Abbeville Institute scholar Don Livingston talks about. He talks about this all the time. There's Jeffersonian America, and then there's Lincolnian America.
Yeah,
and though you need the Ajax and the Odysseus, or for Lincolnian America, and there are various aspects to both Sherman and and Grant that make them. That make them more they fit into this slot better. You know, there's a redemption narrative with, you know, with Grant and his drinking. Then there's the unconditional surrender myth, you know, of his actual name. And then there's Sherman, who made Georgia howl. These are, you know, these are things that can be easily mythologized, and they're not, you know, it's not, you know, I would expect, and I don't know how this works. I would expect military types to be more interested in either, you know, or in Nathan Bedford Forrest or in Thomas than but in terms of popular myth making, I mean, it's relatively easy to see why he gets, because he's not exciting. No. You know, but this is sort of like me. This is one of the reasons why I like Longstreet so much, is he's not particularly exciting. He's just a good technical soldier.
Yeah. And the supreme counter signaler.
Well, now it's time to get to Grant. One of the things from the Confederate point of view, the lost cause point of view, they tend to focus on the Eastern Theater because that's where Lee is and Stonewall and all the victories. But in many ways on the Western Front, Grant was the ever victorious general. From his opening salvos at Paducah all the way down to Vicksburg. Most of the time, Grant's failures, failing to take the initiative, had to do with higher-ups like Halleck or incompetent corps commanders like Buell. And once that all got sorted out, and he and Sherman got working together in late 1862, early 1863, that's when things started really happening. The other thing Grant had was a tremendous capability to learn from previous mistakes. Shiloh was a mistake that was never repeated. Also, I think it was the summer of 1862, he tried to besiege Vicksburg, but left his supplies unprotected, which were sacked by N.B. Forrest, forcing him to winter back again, and I think it was Western Tennessee. But again, that mistake wasn't repeated either. And one of the things that he does in his Vicksburg campaign is he does an incredible battle of maneuver through Louisiana to outflank Vicksburg to get on the other side of the shore to to encircle the city and attack it.
I wish you could see my eye twitching right now.
Time to say your piece on Grant.
Well, the thing that is really remarkable about Grant is his ability to eschew conventional logic. You know, he's told, I mean, he has a lot of help, and, you know, in a lot of these cases, he's never, except possibly at Shiloh, he's never opposing the cream of the Confederacy. But what he does really well is he eschews conventional logic over and over and over again. He's told you cannot march through the swamps and, you know, and besiege Vicksburg, but he does it. He's able over and over again. This is, you know, this is one of these things that makes, you know, the modern American pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you know, type of people love him, is over and over again. He simply refuses to, and, you know, if you listen to, you know, he's almost like a Roman general, or like, he refuses to accept that he's been beaten ever. You know, it just doesn't happen. That's where the unconditional surrender myth comes from. But, you know, he also, his reputation is won early on at Fort Pillow. Whenever because he becomes this guy who, especially in comparison to the Eastern Theater, where, you know, Robert E. Lee is at the time making federal commanders look dumb. You can always rely on, you know, on Grant and Grant is never, at no point in his life is he doesn't ever try to do this encircle and destroy the whole enemy army thing, except at Vicksburg. And I don't even think, you know, it's what because it's a siege, and it's just the way siege works.
Yeah,
but
mostly it was a matter of attrition, or trying to force attrition.
One thing to interject here too is that Grant tended to eschew taking fixed positions like cities or forts. Grant tended to seek the destruction of the enemy army, not necessarily through encirclement per se, but fast forwarding to his wilderness campaign, he tells his commanders to get as close to Lee as possible and never let Lee get too far away.
Right. No, that's exactly what he does. He has good cavalry commanders as well who are gonna ride around destroying baggage trains and that sort of thing. But like, you know, if you want to compare fighting styles, Lee is a boxer, Grant is a bruiser. Well, like what he's gonna do is he's gonna pull you really close and he's gonna punch you over and over and over and over again.
Hugging the belt.
Yeah, and low blows, kidney punches. He's gonna do everything because he is really the first guy in this war that recognizes the rules don't matter at all anymore. The only thing that matters is winning.
I was going to say, in that sense, his operational his tactics almost resemble Mao's more than anything. Mao, when he got to his third phase with actual maneuver force, where, like you said, it's holding them close, continuing to hit them over and over and over again, you know, inflict casualties that the other side can't afford to take.
You know, he's famous for Wilderness, and then, you know, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and then, you know, the disaster at Cold Harbor, and then he's famous for killing, you know, a lot of people, a lot of Confederates, a lot of his own people. But you know, that's a pattern of behavior that follows him back west. If you look into his past, the attrition rate among the Western commanders, and a lot of this is because of Maine, people from Maine and Minnesota operating in, you know, deep South bottomland. The yellow fever casualties are incredibly high, and he keeps driving them forward. He also, especially in the West, he has a secret weapon that not a lot of people talk about. He has the Union Navy, who are the Confederate Navy is absolutely unable, like, you know, they build this, and I love this ship. They build the CSS Arkansas, and that's, you know, they have basically, and it you know, it fights one battle, and then it, you know, the boiler breaks and they scuttle it. But over and over again, he's able to wait on the gunboats to come up, and then it's almost like a Verdun style campaign where he just pounds the Confederates with an amount of artillery that they simply can't match. So he's really, I mean, what Grant is about doing is applying overwhelming firepower, you know, all the time. It's this very, and this seems to us logical, but it was an innovation at the time. It was a broad innovation at the time, because, you know, people like Lee, they're used to doing things like, you know, maybe even conversing with the enemy commanders, you know, stuff like that, send a message across to them or whatever. You winter in camp. Like Grant is really inventing like the Totten Creek style of warfare in real time. And, you know, he ends up being the only, there people always have these myths about, you know, like, Prussian military observers looking at the American Civil War, and, you know, like following the model of Confederate sharpshooters for their stormtroopers or stuff like that. Grant is the only real commander from the Civil War that I can think of. And then there's Stonewall Jackson's Valley campaign that, you know, people like because of its elegance. But, you know, in terms of development of modern warfare, Grant is the one that you study from the American Civil War. And this is the one where, you know, people looked at the casualty list and they were shocked, but then they were always like, the man wins battles. You know, he's a terrible person. You know, he is personally, he's awful. And, you know, he becomes president, probably the second worst president in American history.
He was pretty bad as president.
Yeah, but he wins battles on the field, and he picks the right battles to fight. He takes out important strategic targets. This is something Lee doesn't really do. Like Lee's greatest victories are at Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg, both of which have minimal strategic impact on the bigger picture. When Grant decides to fight a battle, that battle means something.
I think you can argue Grant is probably the greatest strategist of the war.
For political reasons, I can't say that.
Yeah, obviously. In terms of strategy, I don't even know that he was that great a strategist so much as he was one of the few who had an operational tactical approach that supported that strategy.
Oh,
you know, the South.
Grant almost got the farm the same way Jackson did. One time in the Wilderness Campaign, he was reconnoitering around, and there was a brigade of Confederates that wore blue coats, and he thought that they were Union soldiers. He walks up, and this one guy's smoking, chewing tobacco, and he says hi, and the guy waves at Grant. And then I think Grant realizes he made a mistake and just walks back in the other direction, and nothing happens. He almost got shot by the Confederates. So
yeah, what might have been.
Well, the is that a unit that Grant was in charge of, he wouldn't have gotten away.
Yeah,
like, you know, like the Confederates are operating on this whole other wavelength at this point, and they're like, you know, well, there goes the Union commander. And like, you know, there are no instances. I mean, there are no instances. There are instances where Confederates do things like, you know, pick off Union commanders from like 300 yards away or anything like that. But there are hardly any stories like this where, you know, Confederate commanders escape a near brush with the Union Army, or, you know, or anything like that. They get captured at best.
Yeah, like I said, he brought forward a tradition of attrition warfare that combined elements of maneuver warfare. So he was definitely a second generation commander in the sense that Lynn would talk about. And yeah, I definitely think that I know there were Prussian observers and there were British and French observers, and they all paid attention. At the same time, the German stormtrooper tactics of the late World War I were designed basically to defeat that kind of attrition approach, to get into their rear and through a strategic flank and just roll them up from the back end. So yeah, Grant, he had this operational approach where he used operations and tactics to support strategy. And you're right that I think that unfortunately Lee really was not the greatest strategist in the sense that he fought wars or battles that he won decisively, but it didn't really serve any purpose.
Well, what it really is, it's a difference between winning battles and winning wars.
Exactly. Ultimately, yeah, exactly right. It's, you know, much like I tell people in our milieu that ultimately it doesn't matter whether or not Charlottesville was a win or a loss if it didn't support any strategic objectives. That's the same thing. Fighting and winning is not the same thing as winning a war. And if your battles don't support larger strategic objectives, you know, all you did was lose men and equipment and, you know, and wealth that you can't replace. And, you know, people are just bloody and dead, unfortunately. And I cut you off, Todd.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. I was just going to say, it's Nathaniel Green all over again. I don't win a single battle, but I don't have to.
No, right, exactly.
Because that's going to defeat Cornwallis. And that's exactly the same with the Viet Cong and Vietnam.
And that's the fact. It is disappointing that nobody had that level of strategic insight that Grant had. And I don't even think it
was there. I mean, it was there. Nathan Bedford Forrest has it. Quantrill has it. Richard Taylor in the Western Theater has it. And this is
but unfortunately, they're not strategic level commanders the way Lee was.
Well, yeah, right. And this is where the problem with Jefferson Davis's, you know, top down managing of the war comes in, where they're all, you know, and this is where that, you know, as much as I love that chivalrous cavalier kind of tradition, there were so many mental blocks in the minds of the Southern ruling class that prevented them from thinking this way over and over and over, that I'm not certain that there was anything that could have overcome it.
That's true. Ultimately, the South at some point would have had to find a way to a successful South would have to replace a gentry that was LARPing as knights and turn them into something like a Junker class, and that sadly was not in the cards.
Yeah. Now we're going to have to get to eventually the dreaded William Tecumseh Sherman. Now, William Tecumseh Sherman, for the first 2 years of the war, is a subordinate to Grant. And that's part of the mythology. There's this close relationship with Sherman and Grant. They trust each other. It really looks good for the movies and the propaganda reels. But when he gets independent command in 1864, when he's going towards Atlanta, really, Jefferson Davis was his own best ally by firing, Beauregard, because Beauregard was, despite the fact that Beauregard was outnumbered 2-1, he was limiting Sherman to a couple miles a day. This is a snail's pace. And as I already mentioned, Sherman, against the advice of George Henry Thomas, stupidly attacked Kennesaw Ridge. And what did he do at the end? He just outflanked him anyhow. So that begs the question, why didn't he outflank him in the first place? He's still operating like Grant. You just got to hammer these guys. But like Grant, he can hammer them. He keeps them close, and he destroys them.
Well, I mean, at this point in the war, there are massive political considerations. This is 1864 is the most mercurial war of the entire year, because if you're not aware of what the political considerations are on the home front, you have to. And there's a great book called "Why Confederates Fought." Anybody who wants to like find out about this, this sort of last full year of the war, you should go read that to find out. But both Grant and Sherman are under tremendous pressure to win at all costs right now, because there is the possibility, again, even despite the loss at Gettysburg, that political capitulation on the part of the northern population is possible. It's a presidential election year. And McClellan is a wildly popular Democrat. There are still more Democrats in the North than there are Republicans. Because in 1860, Lincoln wins, just barely wins the presidency, and he does it with a plurality of electoral votes, if I remember correctly. But In the Kennesaw Ridge thing is like, why not? If you attack from the front, and if that doesn't work, then we outflank. This is the thing about Sherman, is that Sherman is a little cold-blooded. He's a northerner who lives in the South, and he makes his money burning down cities that he had enjoyed spending time in, and But from inside 1864, we're not gonna just attack the flank. We're gonna attack the front, and we're gonna attack the flank. We're gonna push all of the buttons at once, because this was a real touch and go situation. And you see eventually you see simultaneous wins from Grant and from Sherman, and that was what it took to put Lincoln over the top and get him reelected and keep the war going.
Yeah, and one of the things is, again, we're talking about the shifting into modern warfare. With Atlanta was strategically important because that was one of the key manufacturing centers of the South. And furthermore, Georgia just was sort of the heart of the South for its production of clothing and food. And he just, scorched earth, burn it all down. And this is the kind of stuff we'd see later in World War II. And in certain colonial conflicts like the Spanish War in Cuba.
Now, there is also a hack job on Sherman. When Jubal Early and the Lost Causers get started, they print all kinds of seditious libel about this dude. Okay, if you go back and read these stories, there's stories of Union women raping Confederate women and stuff like that. In the official war record, there are no instances of that happening. It's all just made up. But they do cut a materiel swathe through the South that is irrecoverable, capturing guns, and they burn down the plantations, because at this point, you're soundly in total war mode, right? And so what you're doing is you're not fighting the Southern nation anymore. You're fighting the Southern people. You're destroying their ability to. You've already mostly destroyed their ability to replace losses. You've already mostly destroyed their ability to make things and import things and move things around. Now you're going to destroy their ability to sustain themselves. Yeah, it's hard to imagine from the perspective of a very jaundiced world that has lived through the 20th century. We have atomic disasters and all this that sort of dwarf the losses of the American Civil War. But people were absolutely flabbergasted at the number of people who are already dead. And there's and the mindset of 1864, the March to the Sea, everything is this has to end now. Like whatever it takes to make this end, it has to happen now.
Well, exactly. And on a much smaller scale, Sheridan does the same thing in the Shenandoah Valley. Grant gives him famously the order. A crow would have to carry its own pack of food with it to fly over the Shenandoah when you're done. And so this new way of fighting, the South is just, you're right, they're thinking on a totally different wavelength. They're not able to even make the right counter moves because they're not playing the same game. And ultimately, now you mentioned also at Vicksburg the amount of artillery that Grant had. If we zoom out to the strategic picture, due to its commercial and industrial strength, and it's fairly sophisticated agricultural resources as well out west.
Considerably better agricultural resources. You know, this is one of these things that the South was it's in Gone with the Wind, you know, when there's this famous scene towards the beginning of Gone with the Wind, whenever, you know, Ashley and all the refined Southern men are you know, sitting and talking about fighting the war or whatever, and Rhett Butler says, all we have is cotton, slaves, and arrogance. Southern farming was not geared towards the it wasn't crap. It was geared towards producing things that you couldn't live on. And you know, I was gonna say it was a feudal approach that reached industrial levels efficiency for producing cotton and a few other crops that were primarily for trade. And unfortunately, those were things, as you said, you don't eat. Well, and we can't even say that they weren't aware of this shortcoming. Like you have people like you have people like Edmund Ruffin prior to the war, and you have people like Thomas Affleck that are saying you won't even devote 57 of your, you know, because it took about 57 acres at the time to feed a family of 4. You have gigantic cotton plantations of 1,200, 2,000, 3,000 acres, working 500, you know, in some cases 500 head of slaves, and they grow no food. There, you know, there'll be like the wife will have a small garden or something like that, and that'll be where their produce comes from. But they're importing most of their food, and they're importing it from the Midwest. You know, they're buying surplus Midwestern grain. And a lot of this is that there's you know, sort of structural problems. I do believe, because there's a line, you know, there's a latitude and a longitude line past which you cannot grow cotton. And the Bleeding Kansas story is Kansas is like right there at the edge of it. I do believe that had the Yankees had the ability to grow cotton, they probably wouldn't have been sitting quite as pretty in terms of food production. But you know, also Southern manufacturing is geared towards a totally different aim. You know, you can trot out numbers. You can talk about how much iron they were producing. You can talk about how much clothing, how much textile they were producing. But this isn't text. This is very sheer, thin, cheap calico. Southern industry is geared towards keeping their slaves in the field. So they make slave clothing, but they buy their clothes from France or England, or, you know, or somewhere like that. So like what industry they had was not properly configured for fighting a war. Sorry about that. Yeah. This is my serious autism.
No, I get it. Logistics matters ultimately, and winning wars
is in the strategic point of view, due to the Union's superior population, industry, commerce. If the South didn't win quickly, it wasn't likely going to win at all, because of these forces at work against it. And really, one of the things is, in his book, Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, Paul Kennedy points out that by 1863, the Union Army was probably the best fed army in history. So, you know, we also got to remember in 1864 onward, the Confederates were starving, short on ammunition, and short on good clothes. In fact, even in Gettysburg, they were short on shoes. And the Union forces have clothes, shoes, ammo, ammunition, provender, horses. They lack nothing. And we see this again in World War I. There's that great scene at the end of oh, I can't remember that novel now. Oh, Quiet on the Western Front, where the German soldiers, like, the French are eating, the British are eating, the Americans are all fat and happy with ammo and clothes, and we're starving. And going back to Julius Caesar's dictum, an army marches on its stomach. And all of those factors made sure that the Union armies were always well fed and well supplied.
And this advantage cannot be overstated. There's so much that's been written about this particular war that talks about, it goes down to the caloric value of, each daily ration. And one of these is Union bread was made from wheat. Confederate bread was made from corn. There's more nutritional value in wheat than there is in corn. And so it's actually the Dangerous History podcast, with Prof. CJ. He's the one that he goes into this really well. He's got a long series about the war that goes into a lot of these structural causes. If you're interested, it's worth going to listen to. But my favorite instance of this talk about, so at the Battle of Baton Rouge, the Confederate Army sets out from a small town in the West Florida parish. It's called Hammond, and they're marching west in an attempt to retake Baton Rouge. It's a 2-day forced march. Under normal circumstances would have been a 2-day. It was expected to be a 2-day forced march, but Confederate commander got it done in one night. But for the 2-day rations issued to the Confederate soldiers at the time, it was a pocket full of parched corn. It wasn't even ground up. They were just chewing raw corn.
Which means close to a third of the calories at least are just going to go into digesting it.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like the situation is always dire. The South, finally, in terms, I think there are only two ways the South could have won the war, and this is one: if they had turned the Appalachians into Afghanistan in 1860. And not even really pulled together a professional field army. If they had fought essentially what we think of as a fourth generation war today, in 1860, which there's no reason to believe, that especially given the ideological considerations of that, that damn warrior class, they could have done that. And the other one is French recognition. The British were never, ever, 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 ever going to recognize a country that had slaves.
They wouldn't go without the British.
Well, yeah, exactly. The French wouldn't go without the British. But this is one of these myths that's that people, this is if we had convinced Britain was indirectly one of the causes of the war. And this is because Britain is the, in this, this is on Good Morning Why America. I was talking about the Atlantic world. In the 19th century, or in the 18th and 19th century, there's this, this construction historians used to talk about, they call it the Atlantic world, which is this, the countries or the nations and the empires that, that exist along the Atlantic rim, from West Africa up to Spain, Netherlands, England, and then over to Canada, all the way down the South American coast. And it sort of acts, it's not quite like the Mediterranean, where it's not quite like a closed system, but it acts like a closed system. And whoever the kingpin is in this Atlantic world can exert a lot of latent pressure on other countries. And the Brits have, due in large part to Quakers and some other strange groups, they abolished slavery long before the Americans get around to doing so. And from the outset, even from before the British have abolished slavery, there are already incredibly well-moneyed British interests high up in Parliament and in places like this that are exerting pressure on the American states to abolish slavery. The abolitionist movement in New England was funded in England, and there was absolutely no way this liberal faction, it wasn't the Tories. There's absolutely no way this liberal faction is going to allow the prime minister, the prime minister or the crown, or they're not going to allow anybody to join a war on the side of a country that of a nation that has slavery. There is not enough for them to gain. Like, they're afraid of the rising power of America, but not enough to compromise this social program of abolition that they had been pushing for the last 50 years.
Yeah. I think one other aspect to tie in the industry, commerce, and the broader Atlantic world is the Anaconda Plan. George Winfield Scott pretty much came up with the winning idea. Now, obviously, Grant and Sherman went much deeper inland than Scott had foreseen necessary, in part to close the Mississippi River on the Vicksburg campaign. But the basic premise was that the Union Navy would strangle in the Confederate ports, so they couldn't export or import any goods. Now, in the beginning, of course, there wasn't much of a Union fleet to do all that, but all the shipyards were in New England, and they had be able to just swell the fleet within a couple of years. And this naval front led to innovation on both sides. Both invented ironclads. One could argue the Union was a slightly more sophisticated with the Monitor's revolving turret.
It was better. They built more than one of those things. You know, nobody ever tried to build another version of the CSS Virginia.
Having multiple versions matters. Having more.
Yeah. And then, of course, the Confederates had the ill-fated Hunley, which I think sunk on one of its first missions. So it does lead to a lot of innovation on both sides. But, of course, the North has the industry and able to take out loans to pay for the war to finance this kind of research. And by the beginning of the end, I think it is an interesting theory. In 1862, when Farragut takes New Orleans, in order to finance the war, the Confederates promised the English and the French that they could buy cotton at pre-war prices, and if they doubted, they could claim their portions immediately. But once Farragut closes New Orleans, there's no way the South can meaningfully up and support that promise, and that was the largest port in the Confederacy. And so a lot of their credit dries up all over the world.
It was lost so quickly that it's hard to even really contextualize what a blow it was. It was lost so quickly and without almost any defense whatsoever.
Yeah.
There's two forts at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and the Union fleet just ran right by them. There was nobody standing in the way. And New Orleans is, I mean, today, in many ways, it still is the great city of the South. It was. I'm from New Orleans.
More so at the time when it was the primary logistical hub.
It was the fourth largest city in the war. It was fourth largest city in America at the time. It's the only city in the South that has any kind of international credit line. I mean, you could talk about Charleston, that has a lot of aesthetic and a lot of economic similarities, but it doesn't have the economy of scale that New Orleans does. The amount of money that was passing through New Orleans starting in about 1810 all the way through 1860 on a yearly basis would be astonishing in like relative GDP terms if it were, if it were forced today. In 1860, the highest concentration of millionaires anywhere in the entire world is in Natchez, Mississippi. Mississippi and Alabama are the two, in terms of monetary wealth, are the two richest. I think that I know Mississippi is the richest state in the country. I think Alabama is the second, and all of this money, all of this cotton is going through either Mobile or New Orleans, and it's about 80-90% of it is going through New Orleans.
Yeah, I would say Mobile and New Orleans are also both natural harbors that actually they accept heavier, larger, deep water ships.
Well, New Orleans didn't. This is why it took until 1810 for New Orleans to really take off this way, because it's dependent on the mouth of the Mississippi River and the way the river fans out, and until they went in 1810 and dredged it. There was no way to get into the Mississippi River. Like most of the outlets to the Gulf of Mexico draw about 6 feet of water. I mean, they don't anymore. Like this is all gone now because of Corps of Engineers, stuff like that. But it was very difficult to get to New Orleans. But as soon as it becomes easy to get to New Orleans, it explodes in population. Like it grew more from 1810 to 1820 than it did from 1910 to 1920, which is like in one decade it grew by about 17%, which is just astonishing growth. Mobile is the better port. Mobile is the better port, but it didn't have access to the Mississippi River the same way. You had to it's called portaging, where you have to carry Huntsville, Alabama is really becomes the first place where this, where all this money starts filtering, because there's two rivers that Huntsville was sort of right between the Tennessee River and I think it's the Tennessee River and tributary of the Mississippi, and it becomes very easy to move cotton up and down this river, but it's gone in 1863. So this is like 80% of your country's GDP down the drain without hardly a shot being fired. Like I don't know what you're going to do after that.
Exactly. Suddenly you can't export anything.
Because ultimately, I think I would tend to agree with the opinion that the war could not have been won purely by the Anaconda Plan blockade, but it was a crucial element, certainly in the broader total war strategy of Sherman and Grant, to starve the South into submission. So I think the thing I'd like to end with is the same thing we did last time, is discussing how the historiography of the Civil War has changed since it was written, North and South. So I guess that's your field of expertise, Fuller.
Oh, Lord. The way this sort of works, there are four main, and I know this one better than I do the one from last week, because this one is sort of like seared into my eyelids when I go to sleep at night. Immediately following the war, the first important thing that happens is that the United States, in this like sort of like reconciliation, whatever you want to call it, they call it reconciliation, but we know this didn't happen. Whenever they were going to compile the official war record, and I have a copy of this thing. I think it's 108 volumes. It takes up a whole wall in my apartment. There was a controversial decision that was made, which was to allow the Confederacy to tell their side of the story. And so they started including Confederate documents and everything, and this really, I mean, this sort of seems tame by today's standards, but remember, like 750,000 people are dead, and then the Northerners are angry that the South is being able, so there's, from the damn outset, there is this narrative among particularly Northeastern academics and, thinkers, that the South is being given far too much say in how the story is told. And then there's a concurrent development, which is the publication of the Lost Cause book, which, and over the course of Reconstruction, because this is why I said there was no reconciliation. There was none whatsoever. And in 1860, we really have, this is maybe not the first example. I would argue the first example of quote unquote American imperialism is the annexation of West Florida. But this is the first time the United States is really engaged in a quote unquote nation building process. This is the first time also they bit off more than they could chew at once. It would be difficult to militarily occupy and suppress an area the size of the Confederacy today, with flintlock muskets. And then, I mean, I'm not gonna turn up the ethno-spiciness too hard, but most of the Union soldiers and most of the Union Army and most of the Union officers, their enlistments expired almost as the war ends. And so what you're left with are the occupation troops of the Union Army generally tend to be freed blacks. Okay, and this creates immediately all kinds of, and to say it in the nicest possible way, friction. There are riots in Memphis, riots in Arkansas, riots in Virginia immediately. And so there is no, I mean, so almost immediately as this war ends, there becomes a narrative, an official narrative of the war, endorsed by the North, that many people in the North already think the Confederacy gets too much of a say. Then there is the lost cause narrative that gets going, which is at its base, if liberal historians today could look at it, could look at it through their own frameworks, it's an anti-colonial narrative, which is one of the, we will not allow the other side to define the history for us. And these two sides fight back and forth for most of the 19th century, and eventually, at the time Reconstruction ends, it's generally conceded that the lost causers probably won this particular fight, and this is because of the rise of progressivism, which is where scientific racial theory becomes the an obsession of Northeastern academics all of a sudden. And so what they're doing is they realize that according to these ideas that they're tinkering around with right now, that the South was right all along. And so as much as this is where you get these people like Woodrow Wilson, who called themselves progressives, but like the progressives today are just like absolutely embarrassed at the possibility of claiming him as one of their own. But they were, and so the best instance of what I'm talking about now is this Birth of a Nation film that comes out, where at the very, it's a sort of dramatic retelling of the Civil War, where at the very end, what actually happens is when the Negroes that are like, they're so outlandish looking that they end up being the foundation for Romero's Zombies and Night of the Living Dead. Like if you look at the film, they're just like they're like, and like there's a scene where they're in Congress and they all got their feet up and they're smoking cigars and they're wearing like these gaudy suits and everything. And so what ends up happening is at the end of Birth of a Nation is the Ku Klux Klan and the Union Army unite against the Negro menace and drive everybody out. So at this point in time, what everybody has decided is that while the Union won the war, the South more or less won the peace. And of course, I mean, post Reconstruction, when the military occupation of the South ended, which was total and abject failure. Then during Reconstruction, the North was able to occupy cities, but in the backwoods in the South, which is the majority of the South, there were plantation owners who just didn't tell their slaves they were emancipated, and there was no way for the Union to project that kind of power into the backwoods. So they didn't have the power to totally extinguish the opposition. This is a lesson that they've never learned. But then moving forward into the 1930s, the school sort of shifts a little bit. This is when the Dunning School comes on the scene. And they've sort of decided, because during the progressive era, they're reacting. They're sort of really, the Dunning School is sort of reacting against their own school of Southern historiography. They don't like the lost cause. They want to talk about the Southern economy and things about like, well, why the South would win the war. And these, I mean, if you're talking about Southern historians of the Civil War, and these people had cast such an outsized influence on the way that the liberals today still call them part of the lost cause, but they're really formally separate from the lost cause because they're not really interested. The lost cause is kind of a great man theory of history, where like these gods and generals like Robert E. Lee and everything, they're affecting the course of the nation, all of this stuff. The Dunning School is named after Alfred J. Dunning, I think he was a Yankee. Ulrich Bonham Phillips is one of the more famous, is probably the best example of them, and he definitely was a Yankee. He was taught at Columbia. These guys are going to be writing, and they do something that's considerably more insidious than the Lost Cause is to especially contemporary liberal historians. They wrote the best histories of the South and of Reconstruction that have ever been done. And the reason they do this is because they focus on the economy, on like the structural aspects of Southern life and everything like that. And it all culminates in this, and it's all punching around this idea, not that the South could have won the war, but they're undermining the principle of the war itself. They've sort of cottoned on to this anti-colonial scheme in a more formal way. this is during the Great Depression, when people like Huey Long and like the American federal government is at really one of these nadir points of its power. It can barely project power, only in certain places. There's huge lawless stretches of the country where nobody, what the federal government can say something, but they can't really enforce it or whatever. And during this time, this is during the time period whenever the Southern Democrats hold sway in the South. This is the solid South, the Jim Crow South. This is another one of these instances where at this point in time, it looks like the South has won the war. Like they lost the actual Civil War, but they have more or less convinced all of the important people in the country that matter that their cause was initially just, and that their particularness is worth preserving. And even, and this is, also the period, this is the period of time when all of these Confederate statues go up, paid for with federal dollars in a lot of cases. This is the period of time when the Confederate heroes become American heroes at a time when there really aren't very many American heroes. And then World War II happens. And out of World War II, I think I spoke about this last week. It was a school of history called consensus history, where they're sort of they're really starting to get the federal government and the central powers of the state are really starting to get control of everything, because among other things, they've trained an entire generation of Americans to follow orders without questioning. A lot of these consensus historians were involved in the American war effort, and in order to sort of retcon this idea of the Great Crusade and of the great liberators, they harken back to the Great Crusade to end slavery, because that's basically the same thing that you're doing with the Nazis. Is you're liberating Europe. And from this point on, like you can tell a little bit about by the name of the war, it's hardly ever referred to as a civil war prior to World War II. It's going to be the wall between the states, or the war of northern aggression, the wall of northern aggression, or something like that. And this is all another number of other verbiages change, where this idea of these United States disappears. You don't hear that anymore. And following World War II, this is sort of this triumphal march of the Lincolnian state. All of a sudden, the centralized American state that Lincoln brought into existence is a positive good. Homo economicus reigns over culture now. All of a sudden, the things that the federal government did during the war, that they sort of very casually reinvaded the South. If you look at the number of developments, the amount of military infrastructure that the federal government built in places like Norfolk and Galveston and New Orleans and Mobile, whereas there had not been much federal presence in the South, towards for the previous century. And then there's the Civil Rights Campaign that comes along. And when the Civil Rights Campaign comes along, this is, there's right around 1963 is what I want to say. There's this last inflection point after which there are no historians who say good things about the Confederacy. If you graduated from university prior to 1963, you could have potentially written an undergraduate thesis or something like that that says nice things about the Confederacy, and you could have gotten away with it. You probably would have been hammered, and you would have had to say, you would have had to couch it in strange terms by then. But in academia and among the historians whose books get published, by publishers that can be distributed in places that can, where a lot of people can read. After 1963, the Confederacy sort of becomes a vessel for everything that has ever been bad in the American character, and it was sort of confined to academia for the most part for about 30 years after that. But then this is right around 1990. It was actually after that. That famous documentary about the Ken Burns documentary. Yeah, this is this scared the bureaucrats of the Central State drastically, because you have this Shelby Foote comes on, and he's got this old man with this syrupy voice who's easy to listen to, and it sort of frames and this is like a sort of maybe not a consensus framing, but this is there's this idea of the Civil War as this great this great crucible through which America had to go to become a country, and this is the popular understanding of it. The academic understanding of the Civil War has already flipped over to totally negative on totally negative of the Confederacy. But it's only after the Ken Burns documentary comes out that and I'll just call them what they are. I'll call them the left. This is when they realize that they're not winning. They're not winning hearts and minds the same way that they had before. And now all of a sudden it becomes a borderline point of state policy to routinely suppress pro-Confederate messages, or not even pro-Confederate messages, to routinely suppress anything that positively depicts the South as anything other than apple pie in America.
Yeah,
and that's the contemporary state of things, where we're gearing up for the god awful left, literally redeclaring war on the Confederacy, ahead of the Super Bowl match, where they're running anti-Confederacy ads all of a sudden in 2019 about a war that was over 130 years ago, or 150 years ago. Sorry, that was long.
No, that's fine.
No.
Do you have anything?
I don't think either of us have anything to add to that.
No, we don't.
Yeah.
So yeah. I think now is a good point to wrap up. Unless there's anything else anybody else wants to say.
I've got a line-by-line rebuttal of everything he said. That's a joke. Yeah. No, I am not quite the historian that Fulworth is, and that's a tremendous understatement on my part. I think he covered so much, and I agree with all the parts I understand, and the parts that I don't. I definitely need to go out and read. And
we should have found some way to get Cushman on. He wouldn't have made it through me savaging Lee, though. He'd have just popped a carotid and been dead.
Well, if we're done, guys, I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks both so much for coming on. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, definitely.
Go ahead.
I'm going to talk to you once we're logged off. I'm sorry.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.